Hi everyone, hope everyone is well. In this video I'm going to talk about how combat works in the game, and in doing so I'm going to touch on a couple of the other key mechanics such as the morale. Now in terms of combat, I've got an example set up here. We've got some infantry counters from the player and a Sherman, and they have encountered a German Panzer and some German infantry counters as well. And this is just for illustrative purposes, just so I can help talk through the key mechanics. Now there are several steps to the combat phase of the game. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll on the zone combat events table. Then we'll have a look at that in a second. Then we're going to spend our command points to determine what type of attacks or use artillery strikes or so forth. We're going to determine who attacks first. Then we're going to do a combat round, and then we'll determine the victor. And if there's not a victor, then we'll do the next combat round again until there is. Now, so that first phase is rolling on the zone combat. And I've got print out here the zone combat table. You can just see it on there. And basically, when you first encounter new enemies in a territory, then you roll on that table. And with a 2d6, and depending on what die roll you get, depends on the outcome. And sometimes those outcomes can be in your favour, and sometimes they are not. So, for example, on a 2, the enemy surrender. They give up the fight, and they instantly surrender. That's the best result you can get as a player, a double 1. But conversely, there are many other events that can happen that go against you. So, for example, you may run into some mines, or run into some tank obstacles, or the enemies have got barbed wire defences, etc. And of course, there's also a chance that combat will be resolved as normal, and there are no special events. What the table does, is give every single combat a slightly different flavour in the game, and then you have to then contend with that event. Sometimes it's good for you, and sometimes not so much. Now, the second phase is we're going to spend our command points. Once we've worked out any events, then we're going to spend our command points. And I've got on my handy command point tracker player aid here, and I've covered some how you can spend command points in other videos. But in terms of the combat, there's really sort of a few choices that you have to make. You can spend those command points on different items. So, for example, you can spend command points to attack first. So if you spend 2 command points, you can play attack first. I've done a handy little player aid to help remind you if you want to print one out and use it on the board. You don't have to. You don't have to spend any command points if you don't want to. An attack is 0 command points. But if you don't attack first, or you don't determine to attack first, then the enemy will attack first. And again, I've got a little player aid there for you just to remind you, because determining who attacks first is the next phase. But there are a couple of other things you can spend your command points on. So you can spend your command points on an airstrike. We've got our Thunderbolt counter there that we can summon and spend some command points on. And where is it? You can spend command points on an artillery strike as well. So how you spend your command points in combat is one of the crucial decision making parts of the game, because you may be reserving some command points. You don't have an infinite amount, so you've got to spend them smartly. You've got to make some decisions, and sometimes it's a bit of a gamble, sometimes a bit of a push your luck on how you spend those command points. Entirely up to you though. You don't have to spend any whatsoever. But if you don't, the enemy will attack first. Now that's the second phase of combat. The third phase of combat is determining who attacks first. If you spent some command points, sometimes the events from that zone combat events table go in your favour. You will get to attack first, and you can put your player attacks first. The reason I do a player aid for this is that combat can take several rounds, and it's important to remember who attacks first at the beginning. So in this example, let's say that you attack first. Now, before we get into the combat of the infantry and the tanks fighting against their enemy there, then we will determine if you have used a artillery strike. If you spend some command points on the artillery strike, you will use an artillery strike. And conversely, if you have spent some command points on that airstrike as well, that thunderbolt, then you will basically roll for those. Now, how artillery strike works, it's very straightforward. You roll a d6 for every enemy infantry counter, and if you get a 6, then you roll another table to determine what happens to that enemy infantry counter. They can either be destroyed or they can be pushed back into one of those other zones as you're moving. If you're moving across the table in this direction, you're pushing them away from you, pushing them back. There is also, however, the artillery strike can also be used against open-topped vehicles. So, for example, in this example, we've got a Panzer IV. That's not an open-top vehicle, but for example, excuse me, Armada is. So you can, if you're facing an open-top vehicle, an artillery, especially if you're facing an open-top vehicle and enemy infantry, an artillery strike can be very useful because it can target both. But in this example, the artillery would only be able to hit the enemy infantry. It's a small caliber artillery rounds, and doesn't affect the Panzer IV in any way, shape, or form. However, the airstrike, for example, the Thunderbolt. Here it is, the Thunderbolt. Conversely, that is going to target enemy armor, and again, that can determine, again, same mechanic applies. You roll a d6, and if you get a 6, then you'll hit the enemy tank, and in all likeliness, destroy it. But it can be pushed back as well, depending on the result that you get. So that's effectively how you work out airstrikes and artillery. Now, once you've done that, and if you don't have any, then you can just skip that phase. If you've chosen not to use any command points on those, then you're going to resolve the unit combat. And the unit combat is pretty straightforward. So you are going to, if it's your turn to attack, then your infantry counters, for example, can target the enemy infantry counters. It's up to you which ones you target. And your Sherman can target the Panzer IV. Again, entirely up to you. You roll the number of dice, which is the first. If it's an infantry target, it's the first number. So in this case, I'm rolling 3. And I'm modifying that number of dice by anything from the events table that I rolled at the beginning of the combat. Sometimes you get an extra dice. And also, if your force is on good morale, I've got my morale tracker there, and I'm in the green, so I'm in good morale, then I get a bonus dice to my dice roll. So, for example, this infantry counter, let's say this infantry counter, I determine is going to attack that enemy infantry counter there. Then I'm going to roll 3 dice, and I'm in good morale, so I'll roll 4 dice against it. And a 5 or a 6 gets a hit. That enemy infantry counter can make a saving throw. For example, it's a 5 modified by the terrain I'm in. And if it fails it, I roll on another chart to determine what happens. And again, either it will be destroyed or pushed back. In all likelihood, again, destroyed. And it's essentially, in terms of combat, it works as pretty straightforward as that. The same applies for the tanks. I'm going to be rolling the number of dice. If I've got a tank with a armor penetration modifier, such as some of the tanks with the bigger guns, such as the 76mm Sherman, I get a +1. And again, the tank will make a saving throw. And it's as pretty straightforward as that. The things that's important for me as a designer is not so much the intricacies of the mechanics. It's more about the decision making. You have quite a few decisions to make. So you've got to determine how many command points you want to spend. You've got to determine what type of attacks you want to do. You've got to determine which counters are going to attack which. And because it's a solitaire game, it's entirely up to you which ones attack. And it's the same applies for the enemy when they attack you back. The enemy will target, if you've got an armor counter, they will target that. If you've got infantry counters, in this example, they will target those as well. And you just run through the process of combat and determine the outcome. But those key, just to go back, those key decisions are around what type of attacks, who to attack, how to spend your command points, how to balance the morale, because when you're in good morale, you're getting that +1 dice to your combat, which is extremely important in terms of combat. And there are certain things, morale can be influenced. It can go up and it can go down. It can go up as you take over new territories and you take control of territories. It can go up as you take control of objectives. It can go up as you push the enemy back or destroy them. Conversely, it can go down when the counter happens to you. So if you lose territory, you lose counters, the morale goes down. But hopefully that'll give you a brief overview of how the combat mechanics work. Obviously they're fully detailed in the rules, and I've put a description of the combat on the Kickstarter page. So please have a read through that, and if you have any questions, then please let me know. And thanks a lot for watching, as always. Thank you.